Hello, citizens of Europe.
If you grew up in the UK playing the PlayStation, you were living in a slower time. You didn't know it at the time, but every punch in Tekken, every laugh in Ridge Racer, and every jump in Crash Bandicoot was happening exactly 17.5% slower than it was for the kid in New York or Tokyo. It's a bizarre realisation to have 20 years later, that your entire childhood was essentially running in a mild form of slow motion. This was the PAL reality. Because of the way our old CRT televisions handled power and refresh rates, we were locked into 50Hz while the rest of the world was enjoying a smooth 60. But the thing is, we didn't feel cheated. We didn't sit there with a stopwatch comparing frame rates. We just sat on the carpet and played. We saw the massive black bars at the top and bottom of the screen, the letterboxing caused by developers not filling out the taller resolution, and we just assumed it was supposed to look like that. To us, it looked cinematic. We heard the music running at a slightly deeper, sluggish pitch and thought it sounded moody. We were the architects of our own satisfaction. In an era before YouTube and digital comparisons, ignorant wasn't just bliss, it was the standard operating procedure. We weren't missing out on the real version because, to us, our version was the reality. This wasn't a technical failure, it was just how the weekend felt. This episode isn't about counting frames or arguing over signal frequencies. It's an autopsy of the specific 90s bubble. It's the ghost games we saw in magazines but could never buy, the superior look of our shelves compared to the rest of the world, and the architecture of the struggle. The mod chips and the import shops became a culture all its own.
The worst foe lies within. Parasite E.
Welcome to the PAL Betrayal, 17% slower and 100 or more games short. While the mission is usually to document all 1,278 games released in North America, today we're stepping sideways into the world I actually grew up in. Growing up in the UK meant being part of a massive, unintentional social experiment. We were right in the middle of a global gaming gold rush, but the version of 32-bit revolution we received was filtered, delayed, and in many cases, physically squashed. If you were a fan in Europe, your world was defined by a specific kind of regional isolation. We were caught between the creative output of Japan and the marketing machine of America, often left waiting for months for games that our cousins across the pond had already finished and traded in. It was a world of ghost games, legendary titles that never officially touched our shores. Names like Xenogears, Chrono Cross and Parasite Eve felt more like urban legends than retail products. Things you only saw at the back of magazines or heard about from that one kid at school who claimed his uncle lived in Seattle. We were systematically denied some of the greatest experiences of the generation, yet we didn't spend our time protesting. We were too busy looking at our shelves. There's a certain design dignity in the uniform black spines and chunky, clear dual cases of the PAL library. It gave our collectors a sense of order and a weight that the American releases just didn't have. To us, the US library looked a bit like a disorganised bargain bin, while ours looked like a curated archive. We might have been running at 5/6 of the speed, but we did it with a bit more style. Then there was the import underground, that specific 90s era where getting your console chipped wasn't just about playing games for free, it was an act of rebellion. It was the only way to break the region lock and play the RPGs the industry decided we weren't allowed to have. But mostly, this is about the memory of being perfectly content with what we had. We didn't have the internet to tell us we were being shortchanged. We just had the hum of the CRT, the sharp glow of a SCART connection, and a library of games that felt like magic, even with the black bars. Let's start with the stuff we weren't allowed to touch, the ghost games that defined our envy. In the late 90s, the Atlantic Ocean might as well have been a brick wall. If you were a UK gamer flipping through the pages of a magazine, you were constantly being haunted by games that didn't technically exist in our reality. We call them the ghost games. These were the titles that received glowing 5-star reviews in the import sections. Games that looked incredible in tiny grainy screenshots, but were nowhere to be found on your shelves at your local HMV. The most painful sector of the ghost library was the RPG. For some reason, the powers that be decided that European audiences simply weren't interested in deep narrative-driven epics. While the US was losing their minds over Zero Gears, we were left in a void. They were the pillars of the 32-bit era we were systematically denied. Final Fantasy Tactics, Chrono Cross, Valkyrie Profile, Legend of Mana, Parasite Eve, these weren't just games we missed, they were the pillars of the 32-bit era that we were systematically denied. There was a genuine psychological weight to this. You'd go to school and talk about these games as if they were myths. You'd hear the rumours of a sequel to Chrono Trigger or a tactical Final Fantasy, but without a way to actually see them. They felt more like legends than software. It created a strange tier system in the UK playground. There was the standard kid who played what was in the shops, and then there was the kid who knew about the imports. Even when we did get the big titles, we often got them months, sometimes nearly a year after everyone else. By the time Final Fantasy VII or Metal Gear Solid hit the UK, the rest of the world had already moved on. We were always living in a cultural wake of the US and Japan, picking up the pieces of a hype cycle that had already peaked somewhere else. But this drought actually did something interesting in the UK community. It made us appreciate the weird outliers we did get, and it fueled the desperate creative hunger to see what was behind the curtain. We didn't just want to play games, we wanted to break into the forbidden library, and the hunger is exactly what gave birth to the import underground, a subculture of mod chips and back alley deals that defined the era just as much as the games themselves. Because of the region wall, a massive grey market exploded across the UK. If the industry wasn't going to give us the games, we were going to find a way to take them. This was the era of the import underground, a time when your local independent computer shop felt more like a den of digital outlaws than retail business. This was where the mod chip came in. To a kid in the 90s, the idea of a mod chip was pure cyberpunk. You'd hand over your console to a bloke in a fleece jacket behind a counter, and for 20 or 30 quid, he'd soldered a tiny piece of silicon onto the motherboard. When you got it back, the regional shackles were gone. Your PlayStation was suddenly multi-regional. It was the ultimate act of rebellion against the 30Hz prison. Suddenly, those ghost games were real. You could walk into these shops you'd see filled with the NTSCU titles, the long box American imports, and their strange large cover art. You'd buy a copy of Chrono Cross or Parasite Eve, take it home, and pray your TV could handle an NTSC signal. If it couldn't, you were stuck playing in black and white, but even that felt like a victory. You were seeing things you weren't supposed to see. I literally have vivid memories of playing games like Parasite Eve and early releases of Resident Evil 3 in black and white and Japanese, just because it was the only way to play it at the time, and my 9-year-old brain didn't want to wait for Resident Evil 3 to cross the pond. There was also the boot disc culture. If you weren't brave enough to have your console opened and soldered, you used these things like an action replay or an exploder. You'd pop the cheat cartridge into the back of the console, swap the discs while they were spinning, a move that sounded like a blender full of gravel, and trick the machine into loading a US disc. This subculture changed the way we looked at our console. It wasn't just a toy anymore, it was a tool we had hacked to bypass a corporate decision. It gave the UK scene a gritty DIY edge. We were the chip generation, a group of kids that refused to let a regional lockout dictate our taste in RPGs. We were breaking the rules just to see the 60Hz light, and for the first time, the 17.5% difference started to become visible. While we were technically losing the war on frame rates, we were winning the war on the shelf. There is a specific high-end feeling to the PAL PlayStation library that I think is often overlooked. In North America, the packaging felt a bit like a work in progress. It started with those giant, fragile cardboard long boxes that look more like VHS tapes, before eventually settling onto the standard slim CD dual cases we see everywhere else. But in the UK, we had the chunky dual case. These weren't your standard flimsy music cases. They were double thick, clear plastic bricks with a heavy, satisfying weight to them. They felt like a premium product, something that deserved to be looked after. And then there were the spines. If you look at a US PS1 collection, the spines are often a mess of different fonts, white backgrounds and inconsistent branding, but a PAL collection is a wall of uniform black and white perfection. The vertical PlayStation logo on the left, the clean centered text in the middle, and consistent branding across every single release. When you line up a row of PAL games, it doesn't look like a pile of toys. It looks like a curated archive. It looks like a library. There's a certain design dignity in that consistency that gave our hobby a sense of legitimacy. Even the most budget bottom tier titles still felt like they belonged on the same shelf as Metal Gear Solid. Then you had the cover art. European design in the 90s tended to be more restrained and atmospheric than the loud marketing of the US. While American covers often leaned into big, aggressive logos and action movie tropes, PAL covers often used cleaner layouts and more moody, centered imagery. We might have been playing a slower version of the game, but the physical act of taking that heavy case off the shelf and opening the thick, multi-language manual felt like a more substantial experience. We were the kings of the library aesthetic. We had the slower games, the squashed images and the missing RPGs, but we had the most beautiful collections in the world. It was a trade-off we didn't even know we were making, but looking back at the shelf of PAL spines today, I'm not sure I'd swap that visual order for a few extra frames per second. This is the part of the story where the UK actually pulls ahead, and it's down to a single chunky cable. While we were trailing behind in speed, we were often miles ahead in clarity. In the 90s, the average American gamer was connecting the PlayStation to the TV using a composite cable, that single yellow plug that smeared colours together and turned every edge into a blurry mess of dot crawl. It was functional, but it was messy. In the UK, we had a secret weapon, the RGB SCART lead. Because of Europe's television standards, almost every TV we owned had a SCART socket on the back. If you were in the know and swapped your standard aerial or composite cable for a proper RGB SCART lead, the difference was staggering. Suddenly, the colours didn't bleed into each other, the text became razor sharp, the pixel art in games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night or Rayman looked like it was being displayed on a professional monitor. This is the great irony of the PAL Betrayal. The US had the 60Hz NTSC signal, which they often joke stood for never the same colour. Their signal was prone to tint shifts and colour instability. Meanwhile, our PAL signal was rock solid, and when combined with RGB, gave us a visual fidelity that most US players wouldn't experience until years later. We were playing a slower game, but we were seeing it in high definition before the term even existed. It's a strange trade-off to wrap your head around. If you put a US console on a standard American TV and a UK console on a decent CRT with a SCART lead side by side, the UK version would often look significantly better. It was cleaner, more vibrant, and lacked that fuzzy videotape look that defined the 90s for so many others. We might have been moving through the world 17% slower, but every pixel of that world was crisp. We were the accidental connoisseurs of the 32-bit era. We didn't have the refresh rate, but we had the RGB light, and in the dark of a rainy Tuesday evening in Liverpool, that extra bit of visual clarity felt like a luxury we didn't even have to ask for.
PlayStation に初登場。君の進む道のりが新たな伝説を作り出す。 聖剣伝説レジェンド・オブ・マナ。
There is a very specific type of peace that comes with not knowing you're being second best. Today, we live in an era of digital analysis, where every frame drop is logged and every resolution dip is a scandal. But in the 90s, the 17% difference didn't exist in our minds. We weren't victims of a technical betrayal. We were just kids playing video games. This is the philosophy of the blissful ignorance. Because we didn't have YouTube comparisons or 60 FPS obsessed forums, we didn't have a frame of reference to feel slighted. When we played Resident Evil, we didn't think the animations looked sluggish. We thought the movement felt heavy and grounded. When we played Wipeout, the sense of speed was still breathtaking, but we weren't comparing it to the Japanese version we'd never seen. We weren't missing the extra frames, because as far as we were concerned, they didn't exist. There's something remarkably human about that. Our satisfaction was local. It was based entirely on the glow of the screen in front of us and the game we'd managed to convince our parents to buy. We didn't need the optimal versions to have the formative experience. In fact, you could argue that our slower timeline gave us more time to breathe in the atmosphere. The slower pace of a JRPG or a survival horror title accidentally leaned into the index vibe, a lingering, slightly more methodical way of experiencing these worlds. We were the masters of make and do. We didn't look at the black bars at the top and bottom of the screen and feel like we were getting 20% less of the game. We just accepted them as part of the frame. It was the architecture of the era. We were perfectly happy with our squashed reality because the gameplay was still there, the music was still hitting the right notes, and the world was still ours to explore. Looking back, there's a part of me that misses that lack of comparison. There was no console war over hertz or refresh rates in the local park. You either had the game or you didn't. You were living in a bubble, yeah, but it was a bubble filled with some of the best memories of our lives. We didn't need 60Hz to feel the magic. We just needed the disc to spin and the Sony logo to appear.
The 5 scrolls. And if you're the real Musashi, you can get Lumina. We're counting on you, you know? Huh? Ripson? Where's Musashi?
He doth be went, princess. Impatient doth he.
Because our games had to be sold across the entirety of Europe, the inside of a PAL jewel case was a very different beast compared to the rest of the world. In the US, you'd get a slim, English-only booklet that usually ended with a couple of blank pages for notes. In the UK, we got the chunky manual. Opening a PAL game felt like opening a piece of international literature. You'd flip past the English section and find yourself staring at French, German, Spanish and Italian. For a kid who would stop off at his nan's before going home after going to Woolworths with his new game, this gave the games a strange sense of scale. You would sit there reading the back of the case, opening the manual, just excited to play. You'd read the English side, you'd read the Italian side. You were just waiting to get the disc home, so you made every little bit of use of that box art and manual. It made you realise that while you were sitting in your bedroom in the UK, someone in Madrid or Berlin was reading the exact same lore in their own tongue. It made the PlayStation feel less like a Japanese toy and more like a massive, unified European event. Technically, this was probably just a logistics necessity for Sony and the publishers, but the human feeling it left behind was one of substance. These manuals were thick. They had a weight and a smell to them that felt more premium than the flimsy inserts of the competition. Even if you only ever read the first 10 pages, the sheer physical presence of the booklet made the £40 price tag feel a bit more justified. There was also a specific bit of humour to these manuals. Sometimes the translations were slightly off, or the English instructions felt like they'd been passed through 3 different languages before landing on the page. You'd get weirdly formal descriptions of the jump button, or overly dramatic plot summaries that sounded like they'd been written in a Victorian poet. It was another piece of the index puzzle, a tactile artefact that we spent hours poring over in the back of the car on the way home from the shops. We weren't just buying a disc, we were buying a multilingual tome that you just don't get with a digital download or a single sheet insert. It added to the feeling that our versions of the PS1, while slower, was somehow more solid than the rest. The speed difference didn't just affect how the pixels moved, It changed how the game sounded. Because the game engine was tied to the 50Hz refresh rate, the music and the sound effects often suffered from a 17% slowdown. In some cases, if the developers were lazy, the pitch of the music actually dropped. Everything sounded a bit deeper, a bit more sluggish, and a bit more haunting. There's a strange, accidental atmosphere that comes with a slowed down soundtrack. Think about the save room music in Resident Evil or the ambient hums of Silent Hill. When you play the PAL versions, those tracks linger just a little bit longer. Those notes feel heavier. There's more space between the beats. For a kid sitting in a dark room, that slight drag in the audio accidentally enhanced the mood. It made the horror feel more oppressive and the RPG towns feel more sleepy and lived in. Of course, in fast-paced games, this was a disaster. If you've ever heard the PAL version of the Tekken or Ridge Racer soundtracks compared to the original Japanese releases, ours sounded like the DJ had a bit too much to drink. The high-energy techno was suddenly a mid-tempo chug. But again, back in the 90s, we had no frame of reference. We didn't know the music was dragging, we just thought that was the vibe of the game. It's another layer of the slower timeline experience. Our memories of these games are literally tuned into a different frequency. When I hear the startup chime or a specific menu theme today, my brain expects a slightly lower, PAL-specific pitch. If I hear the correct 60Hz version, it actually feels wrong. It feels rushed, like someone has accidentally sat on the remote and hit the fast forward button. We were living in a world of accidental lo-fi. We were hearing a remix that the developers never intended, but it's the version that's burnt into our muscle memory. It's a subtle, invisible part of the betrayal, a shift in the very air of the game world, but it's one of the things that makes the UK PlayStation experience feel so distinct when you look back at it now. If there's one visual image that defines the PAL experience, it's the black bars. Because our televisions had a higher vertical resolution than the NTSC standard, any game that wasn't properly optimised for Europe ended up with thick, empty voids at the top and bottom of the screen. Our games were literally being squashed. It was a technical compromise, but as kids, we did something very human with it. We rebranded it. We didn't see the loss of the screen real estate. We saw it as widescreen. In the 90s, the only time you saw black bars on a TV was when you were watching a high-budget movie on VHS. So when we popped in Metal Gear Solid or Final Fantasy VIII and saw those letterbox bars, it didn't feel broken. It felt professional. It felt cinematic. It gave the games a letterboxed aesthetic that somehow made the low-poly graphics feel more like grand production and less like a toy. This was the architecture of the era. We were so used to the squashed image that when a game actually did run in full screen, it almost felt overwhelming. We were comfortable in the squeeze. We accepted that the characters might look a bit shorter and wider than they were meant to, and we just adjusted our internal logic to match. It was a visual language we all spoke, a shared understanding that the real game happened in that middle rectangle. It's only now, when you see side-by-side comparisons, that you realise how much of the frame we were missing. We were essentially playing a compressed version of the 32-bit era, but again, the lack of comparison was our shield. We weren't counting lines of resolution, we were focused on the pixels that were there. The bars weren't a bug, they were the border of our world. Looking back, those black bars are like a watermark of the UK experience. They are the signature of the slower timeline. They remind us of a time when the technical hurdles of the day were just part of the furniture. We didn't need the full screen display to feel like we were seeing the whole picture. We just needed enough room to see the adventure unfold. Eventually, the bubble had to burst. For many of us, the awakening happened towards the tail end of the PlayStation's life cycle, or perhaps the dawn of the PS2. Maybe you finally bought a specialised import magazine that came with a demo disc, or you saw a chipped console running a Japanese copy of Tekken 3. Seeing 60Hz for the first time was like seeing colour after a lifetime of grayscale. Suddenly, the movement wasn't just faster, it was fluid. The animations had a grace that we didn't realise we was missing. It was a red pill moment where you realised that the 15.5% difference wasn't just a technical stat, it was a physical sensation. You felt it in the thumbsticks. The input lag you'd grown used to, that slight heavy feeling in the controls, was gone. This was the moment the PAL Betrayal became real. You couldn't unsee it. Once you knew the music was supposed to be higher pitched, once you saw the characters running at their intended speed without the letterbox squash, the magic of the UK version started to crumble just a little bit. You realised you'd been playing the heavy versions of your favourite games. But there was a strange side effect to this awakening. It didn't make us hate the old PAL collections, it made us protective of them. We started to realise that our experience was unique. We had mastered these games on hard mode without even knowing it. You could beat a boss or nail a combo in the slower, laggier PAL version. Doing it in 60Hz felt like you'd had superpowers. The awakening didn't just change how we played, it changed how we documented our history. It's why we look back now with such specific detail. We realised that the slower timeline wasn't just the standard experience which made it our experience. It was a regional quirk that bound a generation of UK gamers together. We were the kids who lived in the 50Hz shadow, and finally stepping into the 60Hz light made us appreciate the strange, squashed, moody world we'd left behind even more. So where does this leave us? Looking back from 2026, the PAL Betrayal is a fascinating piece of digital archaeology. We live in a world of 4K resolution and 120 FPS targets. The idea of a game being held back for a year or a run at 80% speed just because where you live feels like a fever dream from a less connected age. But for those of us who live through the slower timeline, the legacy of that 17.5% difference is something deeply personal. It wasn't just about the technical specs, it was about the culture that grew in the gaps. It was the thrill of the import shop, the weight of the chunky manual, and the shared cinematic lie of those black bars. We didn't just play the PlayStation, we navigated the hurdles of being a European fan, and that struggle made the hobby feel more earned. That 17.5% difference gave us a version of the 32-bit era that was moodier, heavier, and uniquely ours. It's why when we hear a certain track or see a certain game today, we can tell instantly if it's right or if it's ours. Our muscle memory is tuned to a frequency that the developers never intended, and there's something oddly beautiful about that. We look at a technical limitation and turn it into our childhood. While the mission is usually to document the 1,278 games of the North American library, it's important to remember that for millions of us, these games arrived in a different box, at a different speed, and often with a different soul. We weren't missing out. We were just experiencing the era through a very specific UK-shaped filter. The PAL Betrayal wasn't a failure, it was a character. It's the reason our collections look the way they do. It's the reason our memories have that very specific, sluggish, RGB sharp glow. We may have been 100 games short and 17% slower, but I wouldn't trade that slower timeline for anything.
young man. And here we have a fellow who's been experimenting with PlayStation for only a few minutes. Proof that we saps must be on our guard. Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.